Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. They say some places are cursed. Not in the way ghost stories make you laugh nervously around a campfire, but deeply, profoundly cursed, as if the land itself remembers every wrong ever done upon it. We should have listened to the warnings, but we were too eager, too arrogant, too dismissive of old tales. And so we came to the silent lake, thinking it would be just another adventure. We couldn't have been more wrong. The lake was supposed to be our sanctuary, a weekend escape from the mundane routines of our lives. Emily had found the spot online, a pristine, secluded stretch of water nestled deep within the woods, far from cell towers and the noise of the city. She called it a perfect detox. The rest of us called it creepy, but we still packed our tents and coolers and followed her car down winding dirt roads until we reached it. It was beautiful during the day. The water was unnaturally still, like a pane of glass, reflecting the surrounding pines in perfect clarity. The silence was palpable, broken only by our laughter as we set up camp and teased each other about our lack of survival skills. By nightfall, though, the lake took on an entirely different character. The reflection of the moon on its surface seemed too bright, too close, as if the water was reaching up to touch the sky. We sat around the campfire, telling ghost stories and passing around a flask of whiskey. That's when the first splash came. It was loud, like a boulder had been tossed into the water, but the surface remained undisturbed when we all turned to look. "Probably a fish," Emily said, though her voice wavered. "A fish the size of a car?" Adam joked, but his laughter was thin. The splashes continued, irregular and unsettling. Then came the laughter. Faint, childlike giggles floated across the water, though the lake was empty. "Who's there?" Adam called, standing and squinting into the darkness. There was no answer. Just more laughter, echoing from nowhere. We tried to brush it off, blaming fatigue and whiskey, but unease settled over us like a fog. I volunteered for the first watch, though I wasn't sure what I was watching for. The others retreated to their tents, leaving me alone by the dying fire. The giggling came again around midnight, louder this time. I stood and shone my flashlight toward the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the water. It looked like Emily, but something was off. Her face was too pale, her hair too dark, and her smile was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When I picked it up again, the figure was gone. By morning, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, but the others had stories of their own. Adam swore he saw a man's reflection in the lake when he leaned over to wash his face, a man who wasn't there when he looked up. Emily woke screaming, claiming something cold had touched her face in her sleep. Even Hannah, the skeptic of the group, admitted she heard voices whispering her name from the water. We should have left then. But the rational parts of us clung to excuses, stress, exhaustion, shared delusion. So we stayed. That night, the lake showed us its true nature. Reflections began appearing on the water, distorted versions of ourselves, staring up from beneath the surface. They moved independently, grinning when we weren't. My reflection waved at me with a hand I hadn't lifted. As the night dragged on, the whispers grew louder, and the air became thick with an unnatural chill. Emily tried to run but tripped, landing face first in the water. We pulled her out immediately, but she was different. Her eyes were glassy, and she spoke in a monotone, insisting she was fine. But she wasn't. Her smile never faded, even when Adam tried to shake her out of it. We spent the next day desperately trying to leave. Adam's car wouldn't start. The dirt road we came in on seemed to vanish, replaced by endless trees. Our compasses spun uselessly, and even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. By the afternoon, Emily wandered off, humming a tuneless melody. When we found her, she was standing ankle-deep in the lake, staring at her reflection. She didn't respond when we called her name, and when Adam tried to pull her back, she whispered something that chilled me to the core. "It's so peaceful down there." One by one, the others were lured to the water. Adam chased what he thought was a crying child and didn't come back. Hannah claimed she saw her mother calling to her from the lake and walked in before I could stop her. Each time, I heard the splashes, the laughter, and then silence. I tried to keep the fire burning, hoping it would ward off whatever malevolence surrounded us, but the wood refused to catch. My phone, useless for calls, began to flicker with images of the lake, the reflections, and my own face, staring back at me with that same too-wide smile. Now it's just me. The reflections are everywhere, surrounding me, taunting me with faces that aren't mine. I can hear my friends' voices, calling from the lake, begging me to join them. My flashlight is dying, the fire is out, and the water is so still, so inviting. I'm writing this in the hope someone finds it. If you're reading this, stay away from the silent lake. Whatever it is, whatever it wants, it's patient. And it always gets what it wants. I couldn't fight it anymore. The whispers grew louder, each voice cutting through my resolve like a blade. My friends' laughter intertwined with the childlike giggles, urging me to look into the water. Just a glance, they promised. Just one glance. My feet moved on their own, dragging me closer to the lake's edge. The surface shimmered, unnaturally still, reflecting the dark sky and the twisted silhouettes of the trees. But as I looked closer, I saw them, Adam, Emily, Hannah, all smiling up at me from beneath the water. Their eyes sparkled with an otherworldly light, their hands reaching up as if to pull me in. I tried to resist, but the pull was irresistible, a tide within my own mind dragging me forward. The cold water lapped at my ankles, then my knees. My reflection was there now, staring back at me with that same too-wide smile, its hand beckoning me to join. My thoughts grew sluggish, the fear dissolving into an eerie calm. And then, I fell. The water was icy, wrapping around me like a shroud. I expected to sink, to drown, but instead, I floated, suspended in the darkness. Around me, my friends were waiting, their smiles welcoming, their laughter echoing in the depths. They weren't dead. Not exactly. We were together now, part of something older and larger than ourselves. Above, the lake returned to its unnatural stillness. The campsite was empty, the fire long extinguished. The silent lake had claimed us, as it always did, as it always would. If you find this, heed my warning, leave this place. Do not look into the water. Do not listen to the voices. The lake is patient, but once it has you in its grasp, there is no escape. It was supposed to be a simple family getaway, a weekend of fresh air, campfires, and hiking through the forest. Nothing more than a chance for us to reconnect, to escape the noise of everyday life and enjoy nature's tranquility. But the forest, it had other plans. The moment we stepped into the woods, I felt it, the oppressive silence that hung in the air, a stillness that felt wrong, as if the trees themselves were watching us. It was as though the forest had been waiting for us to cross its threshold, to find the thing we weren't meant to find. I should have known something was off when we stumbled across the cabin, hidden deep in the woods, far from the marked trail. An old, abandoned shack that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and when Dad pushed open the door, I couldn't resist stepping inside. None of us could have known then what we were getting ourselves into. What we found inside that cabin would change everything. It was like stepping into a place that didn't belong in this world, a place that had been waiting for us, long before we ever decided to venture into these woods. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept closer, I understood the chilling truth. We had walked into something far darker than we could comprehend. Something that would not let us leave. I just didn't know if we were already too late. We had been hiking for hours, the air cool and fresh with the scent of pine. Our boots crunched along the dirt trail, the only sound for miles. The peacefulness of the forest should have been comforting, but it felt like a veil, a trap we hadn't yet recognized. My younger sister, Mia, skipped along ahead, carefree and oblivious to the growing tension in the air. Dad, as always, was the one leading the way, charting out our next move. "We're almost there," he called, turning back to smile at us. "Another hour or so, and we'll be at the campsite." I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees were too still. The birds had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As we rounded a bend, something caught my eye, a glimpse of dark wood in the distance. It was a cabin. A small, decaying structure hidden among the trees, as if it had been swallowed by the forest itself. Its walls were warped, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. "Hey, check that out," Mia said, pulling ahead to inspect the cabin. We hesitated at first, but curiosity got the better of us. Dad was always one for adventure, and the idea of exploring an abandoned cabin appealed to him, especially in the middle of the day. He pushed open the door, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. "Not bad," he said, stepping inside. "Could be a good place to rest for a while." I glanced inside, shivering involuntarily at the sight. The air in the cabin felt damp, stale with age. The sunlight barely filtered through the gaps in the rotting walls, casting long, creeping shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The floorboards creaked under our feet, their groans almost deliberate. "Ugh, it smells terrible in here," Mia said, scrunching up her nose. But as I stepped inside, my eyes were drawn to something else, something far more unsettling. The walls were covered in strange carvings. Not just any carvings, but symbols, twisting shapes and lines that didn't seem to follow any logical pattern. They spiraled into each other like they were trying to tell a story, but one that didn't make any sense. The air seemed thicker here, as if the symbols themselves were alive, watching us, waiting. "Look at this," Dad called, rummaging through some old papers in the corner of the room. "Journals, someone's been here recently." I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. My mom stood nearby, frowning as she flipped through the yellowing pages of an old journal she'd found. The handwriting was messy, frantic in places. One entry made my skin crawl. Asterisk, "They've come again. I hear them outside. I hear their voices in the trees. They told me to leave, but I can't. There's nowhere else to go. I thought I was safe, but the darkness is spreading. Whatever you do, don't stay after sundown. It's too late now. The woods will claim me." Asterisk. I felt a chill run through me. "Dad. Mom." I started, my voice trembling. "I don't think we should stay here. Something's not right." But Dad wasn't listening. He was too engrossed in the journals, muttering to himself about how strange it was for someone to have written all of this. "There's a lot of references to the woods outside," he said, his voice distant. "People have gone missing here. Something about the forest, changing after dark." Before I could say anything else, Mia interrupted. Look outside. The sky's turning weird. I followed her gaze, and sure enough, the sky had begun to darken. The sun was dipping beneath the horizon, painting the sky in unsettling hues of red and purple. The shadows from the trees seemed to grow longer, creeping closer, stretching toward the cabin. "That's enough," Mom said, standing up. "We need to head back before it gets dark." But it was already too late. The moment the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, the atmosphere shifted. The wind howled, shaking the trees outside, and a strange, guttural sound echoed through the forest. It was as if something was calling out, something ancient and hungry. The whispers started then, low, almost indistinguishable at first, but growing louder, carried on the wind. The cabin, which had seemed so lifeless before, now felt alive. Like it was breathing with us, its walls closing in. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, fear gripping my chest. "It's coming from outside." Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the door. Then another. And another. I spun around, my heart racing. Something was out there. Dad hurried to the door, trying to secure it, but the boards rattled violently as if something was trying to break through. The air in the cabin grew colder, an unnatural chill creeping over us, making my teeth chatter. "We need to leave," I said urgently. "Now." But Dad froze, his face pale. His eyes were wide with terror. We can't. If we leave, they'll get us." "What? Who?" I asked, confusion mixing with fear. "The shadows," he whispered, barely able to speak. "They come after dark. We can't escape them. Not once the sun sets." The door rattled again, and this time, I saw them. Figures, tall and twisted, moving just beyond the windows. Their shapes were indistinct, flickering like smoke, but I could feel their eyes on us. Watching, waiting. "They're coming in," Mia cried. I could hear them now, footsteps crunching outside, slow and deliberate, like they were savoring the moment. The whispers had grown into voices, urgent, maddened, coming from all directions. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, a command. "We have to go," I insisted, my voice nearly a scream. "There's no choice. We can't stay here." Dad's eyes, once filled with resolve, were now full of dread. His mouth trembled as he whispered, "It's too late. We should have left hours ago." Suddenly, a massive thud came from the roof, followed by a shrill, high-pitched scream. The shadows outside seemed to converge, a dark, swirling mass closing in on us. We had two choices: stay here and wait for whatever was coming for us, or run and face the terrifying unknown in the woods. But either way, it felt like death was inevitable. I turned to my family, the terror in my eyes matching theirs. "We have to try." The whispers grew louder, the shadows pressed in, and I knew we had to make a decision. But in that moment, I realized it didn't matter. The forest had already claimed us. We made our choice. In a panic, we shoved open the cabin door and bolted into the night. The air was thick with mist, and the shadows of the trees seemed to pulse with life, their limbs twisting unnaturally in the dim light. Every step we took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold us back. The forest was no longer a place of nature, it had become something else. Something hungry. Behind us, the cabin stood silent, its broken windows watching, waiting. The voices were louder now, clearer. They weren't just whispers, they were shouts, urging us forward, but also calling us back. The woods had a pull, a gravitational force, and we felt it with every stride. But we couldn't look back. If we did, I knew we wouldn't make it out alive. "Keep running!" I shouted, my voice cracking, the words barely escaping my throat. My parents, Mia, and I sprinted through the underbrush, the sound of our feet pounding against the earth the only thing that kept us grounded in reality. But even that seemed to fade into the cacophony of whispers that followed us, swirling through the trees like an invisible storm. The path ahead seemed endless, an unbroken stretch of darkness. We ran for what felt like hours, though I couldn't tell how long we'd been fleeing. The forest swallowed the moonlight, leaving us stumbling blindly through the thickening fog. The shadows, too, were growing closer, crawling over the landscape like a slow-moving tide. Then, just as I thought we were about to collapse, the trees began to thin. We stumbled into a clearing, a small open space where the moonlight broke through the clouds. I looked around frantically, hoping to see something familiar, some sign that we were nearing safety. But all I saw were the trees, standing tall and unmoving, as if nothing had changed. My heart raced. The clearing felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't a place that belonged to the forest. It was as though we had entered another dimension, a place that existed between worlds. "That's it," Dad gasped, his voice hoarse. He pointed toward the edge of the clearing where a narrow path led away from the woods. There's a way out." Without hesitation, we rushed toward the path. I could hear the forest closing in behind us, the whispers louder than ever, the sound of footsteps, of something chasing us, growing more distinct. We pushed forward, the clearing fading behind us as we left it in the darkness. The path was narrow, twisting, and treacherous, but it led us out of the forest, into a part of the woods I didn't recognize. Eventually, we reached the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to the rolling hills and the distant outline of the mountain range. We could see the lights of the nearby campground in the distance. Safety, finally. But even as we approached the light, I could feel the forest watching us. The air was still thick with that oppressive presence, and the whispers had not stopped. "Are we free?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "I don't know," I said, my heart heavy with the knowledge that something had followed us. We made it back to the campground by morning, though none of us spoke much about what had happened. We couldn't. We were too shaken, too changed by the horrors we'd faced. But I know now, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, we never really left the woods. The forest, the cabin, had marked us. And even as we tried to forget, I could feel its presence creeping into my thoughts, its whispers growing louder with each passing day. Something had claimed us that night, and it was still watching. Waiting. And one day, it would come for us again. I thought we prepared for everything. The trail maps, the backpacks, the plans to hike up the mountain and return before nightfall. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than we expected, and the familiar path we had been following seemed to vanish into a labyrinth of trees. The more we tried to retrace our steps, the deeper we wandered into the forest, until the trees felt like towering giants looming over us. We checked our phones, no signal. I could hear my friends' voices rising in anxiety, their steps growing more frantic as the shadows thickened. We weren't just lost. We were alone, completely alone in a place that didn't feel right, as if the forest itself were conspiring against us. The air had turned colder, and a heavy fog began to creep in, curling around our legs and swirling between the trees. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of bark and tangled branches, all merging into the suffocating dark. We had no choice but to keep walking. The farther we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The ground beneath our boots was soft and spongy, as if the earth itself were sinking. Each footstep seemed louder than the last, echoing in the hollow quiet of the night. My breath came out in shaky puffs, and the others were silent, too, their faces pale under the fading light. "Maybe we should just sit and wait until morning," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We'll be fine until then." "No," I snapped, more harshly than I intended. "We can't stop here. We'll freeze to death before morning. We just need to find a way out." It felt like an eternity passed as we kept moving. My eyes darted to the shadows, convinced I saw something moving just beyond my sight. But it was always just a trick of the mind, until I saw him. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, almost blending into the darkness. An old man, standing still and silent, his back slightly hunched. He was holding a lantern, the flame weak and flickering, casting odd shadows around him. My first instinct was relief. A person. Someone to help us. But as I stared at the dim glow of the lantern, a chill ran down my spine. There was something strange about him. "Hey!" I called, stepping toward him. "Can you help us? We're lost." He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his weathered hat. My heart beat faster as he slowly turned his head toward me, his gaze dark but unreadable. Then, without a word, he started walking, slowly, deliberately, his lantern swinging in front of him. The flame flickered weakly, but it seemed to pull at me, urging me forward. "Should we follow him?" Emily asked, her voice quiet and unsure. I looked back at her. He might know a way out of here. It's better than wandering around blindly. My friends hesitated, but one by one, we started to follow the old man. The air felt colder with every step, and the shadows grew longer, stretching out across the forest floor like dark fingers. The lantern's flickering light seemed to be the only thing keeping the night at bay, but even that didn't feel reassuring. It felt wrong, unnatural. The old man led us deeper into the woods, his steps slow but purposeful. He didn't look back, and we didn't dare speak. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the far-off call of a bird, or was it? The deeper we went, the more I felt like the forest was closing in on us, the trees leaning in like they were watching, waiting for something. And then, just when we thought we had gained ground, he stopped. The lantern swayed in his hand, casting erratic shadows that made the trees seem to twitch in the corner of my eyes. He turned to face us, his mouth barely moving, but I could hear his voice clearly. Closer now, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, as if he hadn't spoken in decades. We were too far in now to turn back, but something told me we should. My gut twisted with unease, but I pushed it down. My friends were already moving toward him, and I couldn't bear the thought of being left alone in this suffocating darkness. We stepped forward, the light of the lantern barely illuminating the twisted path ahead. The air was thick now, heavy with an almost oppressive silence. The trees seemed to close in, their branches gnarled and knotted, clawing at the sky like the fingers of some ancient beast. Then, without warning, the old man was gone. One moment, he stood there, his lantern glowing faintly, and the next, he had disappeared into the thick woods, leaving only a lingering scent of decay in the air. "Where did he go?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. "But we need to find him. He could be our only chance." We scattered, calling out his name, but there was no answer, just the mocking silence of the forest. The further we went, the darker it became, the shadows pressing in on us from every direction. Suddenly, we heard a scream. It was distant, distorted, and echoed with a kind of horror that made my blood run cold. The sound crawled into my ears, reverberating through my chest. It was the kind of scream that sounded inhuman, as if something was being torn apart in the most agonizing way. "That came from ahead," Emily gasped, her face pale with fear. Before any of us could react, the lantern appeared again, far off in the distance, barely visible through the twisted trees. The old man's form loomed in the glow, but there was something wrong with him now. His face seemed distorted, twisted with malice, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. His lips barely moved, but I could hear him beckoning us. "Come closer," he whispered, a terrible, mocking lilt to his voice. "Come closer." We moved forward again, but I could feel the dread pooling in my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run. But the lantern's light tugged at me, urging me onward, as if I had no choice. The woods grew more twisted, the trees leaning at unnatural angles, their branches clawing at the air. The sound of the wind had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath us became soft and spongy, the air thick with something foul. When we reached the clearing, the truth hit me like a physical blow. The lantern man wasn't leading us to safety. He wasn't trying to help. He was leading us into something far worse. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, worn and cracked by time. Surrounding it were figures, twisted, broken, their bodies bent in unnatural angles, their eyes hollow, skin gray and cracked. They knelt around the altar, their faces frozen in expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. And standing at the altar, illuminated by the sickly light of the lantern, was the man, only he wasn't a man anymore. His form was shifting, warping into something otherworldly, something that didn't belong. His eyes were glowing, not with the soft warmth of a lantern, but with a malevolent, hollow hunger. His lips parted, revealing teeth too sharp, too many, a monstrous grin stretching across his face. "We're too late," I whispered, my voice trembling. The truth settled in, cold and terrible. We had been led here, not for help, but to join them. To become part of this place, this nightmare. As I turned to flee, the shadows moved. They closed in, twisting around us, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the lantern's flickering light, pulling me into the darkness, deeper than I could ever imagine. The darkness swallowed us whole, and my mind began to unravel. The lantern's light flickered and warped, as if it were no longer a guide but a beacon to something far more sinister. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the very ground beneath us seemed to pulse with some ancient, malevolent force. I couldn't move. My legs were like lead, my body paralyzed with terror. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of my friends, soft, desperate whispers, muffled gasps, and then, silence. I turned my head, but the world around me had shifted. The clearing was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of blackness. The trees, the sky, everything was gone. It felt like we were suspended in some terrible void, trapped between dimensions. And then, the old man appeared again. This time, his form was no longer shrouded in a flickering glow of the lantern. The light was gone, and in its place, an unnatural darkness clung to him, a suffocating shadow that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now glowed with an otherworldly fire, burning with hunger and malice. "Welcome," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. "You're finally where you belong." I tried to scream, to run, but no sound escaped my throat. The darkness pressed in closer, smothering me, and the weight of it felt like 1,000 hands dragging me down. My friends were gone, no trace, no sound, as though they had never existed. Only the lantern man remained, a grotesque figure in the vast emptiness. "Don't worry," he said, his voice smooth and soothing, but it was laced with something far darker. "You'll be part of the forest soon. You'll become one with it, just like all the others." I felt the darkness closing in on me, the very air thickening, pressing on my chest, my lungs burning. The world was fading away, leaving only the oppressive blackness and the old man's haunting presence. I tried to fight it, but there was nothing left to hold on to. The forest had claimed me, and there would be no escape. Then, just as I thought I would be consumed by the dark, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A flicker of light, distant and faint. It wasn't the lantern, but something else, a small, fleeting glimmer, a promise of something beyond this nightmare. I reached for it, my body moving despite the crushing weight that held me in place. But it was too late. The darkness overtook me, and the last thing I heard was the soft, mocking whisper of the lantern man. "One step closer, and you'll be mine forever." And then, there was nothing. The forest had claimed its next victim, and I became just another lost soul, a whisper among the trees. It was supposed to be just another summer night under the stars. A campfire, a few stories, some laughter, and the usual teenage nonsense. We'd been to this spot before, many times, but tonight felt different, strange, even though we couldn't place why. The kind of night where the forest seems to breathe with you, and the wind carries whispers of things you can't see. But we were too busy, too caught up in our usual banter to notice the subtle shifts in the air. As the flames danced before us, casting flickering shadows against the towering trees, we shared stories, harmless ones about creepy old houses and strange creatures lurking in the woods. It was just the usual fare until Brandon decided to turn the night upside down. He wasn't known for making good decisions, but this one felt different. This time, it was more than just a dare. We had all heard the stories, the legends that the locals talked about when the wind howled just right, when the full moon cast its pale light through the thick trees. The campfire game, they called it. A foolish game, one that no one should play. They said if you chanted the right words at midnight, you could summon something from the other side, something hungry, something ancient. Most of us had dismissed it as nothing more than a scare tactic to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But Brandon, he had always been the one to push boundaries. The others hesitated when he brought it up, a wave of unease passing through the group. Emma, always the practical one, was the first to speak. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "That's just a stupid myth." But Brandon wasn't one to back down. And so, he began chanting the words, the ones we had all heard in passing, but never thought to repeat. He thought it was a joke, something to get a rise out of us. But that was before the game began. That was before we realized the cost of playing with things that should have remained forgotten. A spirit born from the shadows, a tale to twist and turn. We call upon the legends old, for truth and death to learn. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper in the wind. But then, the fire flickered, just for a second, like something unseen had blown across it. The air grew colder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the others. They were all laughing, nervously, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They hadn't expected it to feel real. "Relax, it's just a game," Brandon said, settling back down with a smug grin. But there was a tremor in his voice now. Still, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the wind, the trees. Maybe it was the stories getting to me. But something had shifted. The air was heavier, charged with a strange energy that I couldn't ignore. The kind of energy that made the night feel alive in ways I couldn't explain. Then it happened. At first, it was subtle. A strange rustling in the woods around us, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was like the trees were closing in, pressing closer, their branches creaking as if they were stretching toward us. What was that? Emma's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't until the figure appeared that we knew something was horribly, horribly wrong. A tall, gaunt shape emerged from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. It moved like smoke, an unnatural stillness in its motions. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a trick of my mind, but then, the eyes. Glowing, blood red, like two coals burning in the black of night. I couldn't move. None of us could. Our eyes locked on the figure, rooted in place by an overwhelming sense of terror. It didn't belong in this world. Brandon finally stood up, his bravado fading, his face ashen. It's not supposed to be real. It's just a stupid game, he stammered, his voice cracking. The figure glided forward, its cloak trailing behind it like the shifting mist. It was coming for us. The whispers grew louder now, unintelligible but insistent. There was no denying it, it was real. It was here. Asterisk you called, asterisk, the voice said, an ancient, rasping sound like 100 voices all layered together. It was the kind of voice that made you feel like your soul was being tugged, like it could pull you into the abyss with a single word. I couldn't breathe. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My legs felt weak. I turned to run, but something held me back, something I couldn't see but could feel creeping over my skin, like the air had thickened, like the very space around us had become wrong. And then, the shadows moved. Figures began to materialize in the trees, just like in the stories, like they were born from the very darkness around us. A woman, hunched and gaunt, her face twisted with anguish, her mouth opening wide to let out a wailing scream. And from the corner of my eye, I saw something else, a creature with too many legs, too many eyes, creeping up from the forest floor. It was too much. I could feel the world around me breaking apart, dissolving into nightmare. Asterisk we didn't mean it, asterisk I managed to whisper, my voice shaky. Brandon. You need to stop. Brandon was frantically flipping through the journal he'd brought with him. He had to know something, anything to stop this. But the words in the book seemed to blur and twist, as if the game itself was warping reality. It's too late, he whispered, his voice hollow. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shook. The earth split, and from the chasm, a writhing darkness spilled out, tendrils of shadow snaking up to grab at our ankles, pulling us toward the abyss. We screamed, all of us, scrambling in every direction. But the shadows were faster. They had us. And then, there was only darkness. When I opened my eyes again, the campfire was a distant memory, barely a flicker on the horizon. My body ached, my clothes torn. My heart hammered in my chest, as though I had just narrowly escaped death. But when I looked around, I wasn't alone. The others, they were there, but something was wrong. Their eyes were empty, hollow, as if their souls had been ripped away, replaced by something darker, something twisted. Their forms were shifting, distorted, half human, half something else. The figures from our stories. I didn't mean for this to happen, Brandon said, his voice breaking. The shadow from the forest was still with us, lingering, watching us with those glowing red eyes. I could feel the weight of the curse on us, a sentence we had unknowingly sealed when we decided to play. The campfire game wasn't just a myth. It was a warning. A warning we should have never ignored. And I knew, deep down, that we couldn't escape. Not unless we played the game to its bitter end. And by then, it might already be too late. The stories had come to life, and now, we were a part of them. Forever. The world was a blur of shadows and whispering voices as I stumbled through the forest, my legs unsteady, my mind racing. My breath came in shallow gasps, each step a struggle as the darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, thicker. The weight of the curse pressed on me, we were the game now star. Brandon's frantic voice echoed from somewhere behind me, but I dared not look back. The others, Emma, Jake, Sarah, were no longer the friends I had known. They were something else, something twisted by the spirit we had foolishly summoned. Their faces, once familiar, had become grotesque masks of pain and hunger, their eyes empty and cold. I could feel the presence behind me, that shadow, moving with me, always there. Every time I slowed or stumbled, I felt its gaze on my back. I heard its voice, no, voices, whispering to me in the language of nightmares, urging me to stop, to give in. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. The trees around me seemed to warp and twist, the forest no longer the place I knew. The very earth itself felt alive, like it was pulling me down, trying to claim me as one of its own. I could still hear the whispers, still feel the weight of the curse we had all unleashed. Suddenly, I tripped and fell hard to the ground. My hands scraped against the jagged rocks, and I screamed in pain, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence that had fallen over the forest. When I looked up, I saw it. The figure. The one with the glowing red eyes. It was standing in front of me now, closer than ever before. It was taller, more menacing, its form now fully defined, a creature born from the darkness itself, its cloak made of swirling shadows, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. It stepped forward, and the air grew colder with each movement. "You summoned me," it said, its voice low and rasping. "And now, you will pay." I tried to back away, but my limbs refused to obey. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, pulling me in. I could feel its presence in every inch of my skin, in the pit of my stomach. It was inescapable. And then, I remembered the journal. The one Brandon had been frantically searching through earlier, the one that held the words to end the game. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, desperation coursing through me. If I could just remember the words, if I could just end this. But the creature was too close now, its form towering over me. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of maddening voices, each one more insistent than the last. It reached down, its cold fingers brushing against my cheek, and I felt the chill of death itself. "End it," I whispered, hoarse and trembling. "Please, end it." Suddenly, a voice, Brandon's, pierced through the chaos. The words, you have to speak the words," he shouted from somewhere behind me, his voice frantic. Before it's too late, I looked back, my heart sinking. He was there, but barely, his form flickering, a shadow of the person he had been. But his eyes, still human, were full of terror. He knew what we had done. He knew we couldn't undo it. But I could try. With shaking hands, I dug into my jacket pocket, pulling out the worn pages of the journal. The words were there, written in a hurried, scrawled hand, the ink faded with age. I could barely make them out through the blur of panic, but I remembered what they had said. The chant, the incantation. The only way to stop it. A spirit born from the shadows, a tale to twist and turn. We call upon the legends old, for truth and death to learn. I said the words aloud, my voice trembling, my throat tight with fear. The creature recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it could feel the power of the chant. Please, let it work. But it didn't stop. It only grew stronger, its form flickering and distorting, as though it was fighting against the very words I spoke. I pushed forward, my voice gaining strength as I repeated the chant again, louder this time. We call upon the legends old, I said, each word cutting through the oppressive darkness, for truth and death to learn. And then, silence. For a moment, there was nothing. No whispers, no cold air, no shadows creeping forward. Just stillness. And then the creature let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that rattled my bones. It screeched, the sound tearing through the night like 1,000 voices in agony, and then it was gone. The shadows receded, the trees creaked, but the darkness lifted. I stood there, breathless, heart pounding in my chest. The campfire was nothing but a distant memory now, a flicker on the horizon that would forever haunt me. I looked around. The others, they were gone. The forest was empty now, silent except for the wind whispering through the trees. I was alone. And I knew, deep down, that the game wasn't truly over. We had called upon something ancient, something that would never fully let go. The shadow would always be there, lurking at the edges of our reality, waiting for the next foolish soul to play. I tried to leave, but the forest itself seemed to shift as I walked, the trees bending, guiding me deeper into the darkness. The game had only just begun, and as long as the legend lived, the spirit would never truly fade. I had escaped, yes. But at what cost? The stories would always remain. And now, I was a part of them. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. A week alone in the woods to disconnect from the world, to escape the noise and find solace in the quiet of nature. I had done it before, many times, actually. The forest had always been a friend to me, a place of refuge. But this time, something felt different. From the moment I set up camp, I could sense it. The weight of the silence was unsettling, the shadows deeper, the trees looming a little too close. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking it, but the feeling never left. The first few days were fine, though. I wandered the trails, snapped photos of the landscape, and spent evenings by the fire with nothing but the crackle of the flames for company. The forest was alive, but in a subtle way, birds chirping, the breeze rustling through the leaves. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, the peace didn't sit right with me. It felt like the woods were too still, too quiet, as though they were waiting for something. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, bending the branches just right to create the eerie sound. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, soft and faint, as though the trees themselves were speaking in hushed voices. I wrote about it in my diary, how the forest felt alive in ways it shouldn't. I convinced myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, things began to change. The rustling outside my tent started. It was subtle at first, small movements in the underbrush, the sound of something brushing against the fabric. I told myself it was a deer or some other creature, just curious, but the anxiety grew. It wasn't just the noise. It was the feeling that followed, the sensation that someone, or something, was standing just outside my tent, watching. I tried to push the thought away. It was silly. There were no other campers for miles, and surely no one would venture this deep into the woods alone. But when the rustling came again, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest, and shone it through the mesh of the tent. Nothing. But there was something on the ground, scratches, faint but unmistakable, as though something had dragged its claws through the dirt. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My mind raced, jumping to irrational conclusions. Bears, wolves, wild animals. I tried to calm myself. I was overreacting. But as the days wore on, the feeling didn't fade. It intensified. I started finding odd marks around my campsite, twisted branches, broken twigs arranged in strange patterns, shapes that didn't make sense. One afternoon, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a series of rocks arranged in a perfect circle, the kind of pattern you'd see in a ritualistic site. I'd heard stories of strange happenings in these woods, of old myths and rumors that had been passed down, but I always dismissed them as superstition. Now, standing in front of that circle, I wasn't so sure. That night, the whispers came again, only this time, they were louder, clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. It was a voice, low and guttural, as though the very earth was speaking to me. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't from outside the tent, not from a person. It was in my head, like a thought that wasn't mine, but somehow real. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was my mind playing tricks. But when I tried to close my eyes and sleep, I heard the cries, distant at first, like a lost child calling out for help. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and scrambled outside, desperate to find the source of the sound. I shone the light through the trees, the beam flickering in the dark. The cries grew louder, more frantic, but there was no one in sight. I called out, my voice trembling, but the woods only answered with silence. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or something else, but the sound was wrong. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. The cries continued, surrounding me, echoing from every direction, but when I moved, they moved with me. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape them. I couldn't stay. I packed up my things in a panic, deciding I would leave first thing in the morning. But when I returned to my tent, I noticed something new, something that made my blood run cold. The ground around my tent was littered with strange effigies. Twisted branches, sticks, and bones arranged in odd patterns, like crude, grotesque figures staring back at me. Their eyes were made of jagged stones, their mouths gaping in silent screams. I backed away, my hands trembling, unable to process what I was seeing. Had someone else been out here? Had they left these things as a warning? The cries returned, louder now, closer. I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. They were everywhere. Above me, below me, behind me, in front of me. A chorus of desperate, tortured voices. In my panic, I stumbled backwards, my foot catching on something in the underbrush. I fell hard to the ground, my flashlight spinning out of my hand, the beam casting erratic shadows across the trees. As I scrambled to get up, I caught a glimpse of something, someone, standing in the distance. A figure, cloaked in shadows, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, without warning, the cries stopped. Silence. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure in the distance didn't move. It was as though it wasn't real, a trick of the light, or worse, something waiting to strike. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come here. Asterisk. The voice was chilling, raspy, like something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I turned to run, my legs shaking beneath me, but as I did, I heard the whispers again, soft at first, then growing louder, swirling around me. I couldn't escape them. They were inside my head, in the very air I breathed. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to get away. The cries were back, louder than ever, and this time, they weren't alone. I could hear footsteps, too, heavy and deliberate, closing in on me. I didn't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch and warp. The woods were no longer familiar, the paths twisted and changed as though they were alive, guiding me deeper into their depths. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I found it, the circle. The same circle of rocks I had seen earlier. It was no longer a strange arrangement. It was a boundary, a trap. I tried to back away, but the figure was there again, blocking my escape. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, empty and cold. The cries surrounded me, and I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just hearing them. They were coming from me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. I don't know how long it's been since then. I don't know if anyone's looking for me. The search party is out there, surely, someone must have seen me leave the trail. But I don't think they'll find me. They won't find my body, not in these woods. Not in this place. The whispers are with me now. I hear them in the cracks of the earth, in the rustling of the leaves, in the very air I breathe. They're everywhere. They know my name. And they're waiting. Waiting for the next camper to step into their world. Waiting for the next one to disappear. I thought I could escape. I thought that if I kept running, if I pushed deeper into the woods, I would find some way out, some way to break free from whatever had ensnared me. But now, as I sit here, hidden in the hollow of a tree, the truth is impossible to ignore. The cries still echo in my ears, soft and distant, as though they are part of the forest itself, but now they are different. They are no longer the frantic pleas for help I once heard. Now they sound like my own voice. My own cry, twisted and distorted, as if something, or someone, has taken my soul and turned it into an instrument of their terror. I don't know how much time has passed. The sun hasn't moved in the sky, or perhaps it's never truly risen. I don't know. Everything is wrong here, the world distorted, the air thick with a heaviness I can't shake. My body aches with exhaustion, but I dare not sleep. I fear that if I close my eyes for even a second, I might never wake up. The effigies I saw earlier. They've grown. They're everywhere now, hanging from the trees, their twisted forms mocking me with their hollow eyes. As though the very forest is alive, watching me, waiting for me to become part of it. I hear the footsteps again. Slow and deliberate, stepping through the underbrush, moving closer. But I can't bring myself to look. I know what will happen if I do. The figure will be there, the one who spoke to me, its cold eyes piercing through the darkness. It will reach out, and I will be consumed by it. Or worse, I will be made to become one of them, one of the ones who whisper, who never leave, who are part of the forest forever. I used to think this was just a dream. That I would wake up in my tent, safe and sound, with nothing but the haunting memory of a nightmare. But I know now. This isn't a dream. This is the forest's curse. It draws you in, makes you part of its twisted web, and then it never lets you go. I wish I could warn them. The next campers who come here, the ones who will stumble upon the same path, who will ignore the whispers like I did. They will hear the cries, the same way I did. They will see the effigies, feel the weight of the forest's eyes on them. And then they will disappear, just like me. But they won't be the last. I know now that there is no escape from this place. I am part of it, and it is part of me. The whispers are mine now. The cries are mine. And soon, they will find someone else. The trip was supposed to be simple, a weekend escape into the wilderness. A chance to leave behind the noise, the screens, and the chaos of everyday life. Just me and my closest friends, far away from the stress of work and city life. We were going to hike, tell stories, cook meals over an open fire, and enjoy the kind of quiet only the forest can offer. None of us knew that this trip would be the one that changed everything. It started like any other camping trip. We set up our tents, laughed over shared memories, and caught up on each other's lives. The night was peaceful, the air crisp and fresh. The sky was clear, save for one thing, the moon. I've never seen anything like it. A deep, unsettling red, casting a strange glow across the landscape, like the world had bled into the sky. It wasn't the typical waxing or waning moon you'd expect while out in the woods. This moon was different, too red, too big, too alive. But I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just the moon, right? But the strange feeling in the air didn't go unnoticed. The animals started acting weird, too still, too silent. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest seemed to be muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was just a feeling at first, something you couldn't quite explain. But then things started to unravel, one by one. Mark was the first to notice it. He was staring into the woods, his gaze intense, almost like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "Anyone else think the animals are acting weird?" he asked, his voice low, though I could hear the tension creeping in. We all looked around. The night was unusually still, the air unnaturally thick. The usual hum of cicadas and rustle of leaves were replaced by an eerie silence. The trees seemed too still, their branches barely swaying in the wind. I thought it was just the cold creeping in, maybe the way the moonlight distorted everything. But then, just as Mark pointed out, the deer appeared. A group of them, standing in the clearing at the edge of the trees, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, frozen, as if waiting for something. I swallowed, trying to dismiss the unease spreading through me. Animals don't just stare like that, do they? "Maybe they're spooked by the moon," Sarah said, though her voice lacked the usual conviction. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling slightly. But her attempt to calm us didn't work. The air was charged, and the longer we watched the deer, the more unnerved I felt. Then, without warning, Sarah stood up abruptly. Her hands trembled as she wiped her brow, her eyes darting around nervously. "We need to leave. Now," she said, her voice shaking. Everyone laughed, but the laughter faltered. Something was off about her. She was pale, too pale, as if the light from the red moon had sucked the color from her skin. There was a strange tremor in her voice. I glanced around at the others, Mark, Jake, and Steve, all as uneasy as I was, but no one dared to speak the truth. Something was happening, something none of us understood. "You're overreacting," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's just the moonlight. You've been working too hard, Sarah. You're exhausted." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were darting around, her breath quickening. She took a step back, looking behind us, as if something was approaching. I turned my head, but saw nothing. The forest was still, unnaturally still, and the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. "There's something out there. I know it," she whispered, almost to herself. "Something is watching us." The others stood, exchanging uncertain glances. No one moved. And then, as if on cue, a loud snap broke the silence. Someone, was moving through the woods. Twigs snapped and branches cracked underfoot, too heavy to be an animal. Mark didn't hesitate. He bolted into the woods without a word, disappearing into the darkness. "Mark!" Jake shouted, but there was no response. Just the sound of hurried footsteps, then silence. I don't know why, but my legs wouldn't move. We all just stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. And that's when Sarah screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I've ever heard, a guttural, animalistic scream that chilled me to the bone. My heart raced as I spun around, but it wasn't just the scream that had me paralyzed. It was the sight of her, Sarah, her body convulsing as if something inside her was trying to tear its way out. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now hollow, empty, blackened pits. She clawed at her face, tearing at the skin as though she couldn't recognize herself anymore. "Sarah!" I shouted, running towards her, but before I could reach her, she lunged at Jake. Her movements were wild, uncontrolled, as if something was forcing her to act against her will. Jake tried to push her off, but she was stronger than any of us had ever seen her. She hissed, a low, unnatural growl emanating from her throat, her mouth wide as she sank her teeth into his arm. I could hear the sickening crunch of bone as Jake cried out in pain, and for the first time that night, I felt the wave of panic crash over me. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Jake shoved Sarah away with everything he had, and she collapsed to the ground, but it didn't end there. She stood again, blood dripping from her mouth, her face twisted into a monstrous grin. "You can't escape," she muttered, her voice warped and alien. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. My legs were shaking, my chest tight with fear. The firelight flickered and danced, casting long, grotesque shadows across the camp. Everything felt wrong. Then, from the darkness of the woods, came Mark's voice, distorted, garbled, and almost too low to hear. "Help me, please, they're coming." Before anyone could react, Sarah's body jerked violently, as if she were being yanked by invisible strings. She let out another scream, one that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The air grew colder, a sharp chill biting through my clothes as the trees seemed to sway in a rhythm they shouldn't have. Something was out there, something ancient, something alive, and it was coming for us. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I heard Mark's voice again, closer this time. "Please, you have to help me. They'll make you, like us." I didn't wait for another word. I turned and ran, not thinking, just moving. The others followed, but I could hear Sarah's ragged breathing behind us, feel the air shift around me as if we were being hunted. We couldn't outrun it. Whatever had taken Sarah, whatever had taken Mark, it was out there, and it was getting closer. The moon overhead glowed brighter, the red light casting an unnatural hue on everything it touched. The forest closed in around us as I stumbled over the uneven ground, my legs numb with terror. The trees seemed to shift, their shadows growing longer and more grotesque. Every step I took felt like a heartbeat away from being caught. But I couldn't stop. I had to survive. Had to get away. Then, everything went black. I woke up later, my body numb and covered in dirt, the sounds of the forest no longer distant, but all around me. The fire had gone out. The others were gone, vanished into the night, like whispers lost in the wind. The moon still hung above us, its red glow a constant, unblinking eye watching me. I was alone. The curse was still there. And it was waiting for me to fall into the same madness. I had to stop it. I had to survive until the sun rose. But with every passing second, I could feel myself slipping further away from my sanity. The darkness was closing in, and I knew that when the sun rose, I would be the only one left. But what happens when the sun sets again? I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. The night stretched on, longer than any night I'd ever known. I could feel it in my bones, the curse, the presence that lingered in the shadows, breathing with the rhythm of the forest. The red moon above me seemed to pulse, growing brighter and more oppressive. My mind was fraying, the fear tightening around my chest like a vice. I couldn't stop shaking. Every creak of a branch, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I stumbled through the woods, aimlessly, desperate, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening, that could end this nightmare. I found nothing but darkness. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the curse, and I was its last prey. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had become meaningless under the watchful eye of the blood-red moon. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I feared what would happen if I closed my eyes. Sarah's face, twisted in madness, haunted me. Mark's voice, pleading for help, echoed in my mind. They were gone, lost to whatever evil had taken hold of them. I was all that remained. I stumbled into the clearing where we had first camped. The fire pit was cold and empty, the ashes long since scattered by the wind. The tents were in ruins, torn to pieces as though something had dragged them apart. There was no sign of the others. Only remnants of what used to be our peaceful retreat, a shattered bottle, a torn piece of cloth, and the stench of blood in the air. It was then that I saw it, the shadow. At first, it was barely more than a flicker in the corner of my vision, but as I turned, it solidified into something I could no longer deny. Something ancient. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and draped in darkness. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but there was something about it that made the air grow even colder. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hungry. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You were chosen." I took a step back, my mind spinning. What did it mean? What was this thing? Was it the force that had taken over my friends? Had they become part of it? The moon above pulsed once more, and I realized with a sinking dread that the curse was not just in the forest. It was in the very sky, the very ground. The red moon wasn't an omen. It was a calling, a summoning. The figure raised its hand, and for a moment, I felt the weight of it press down on my chest, suffocating me. It was drawing me in, pulling me closer, and I knew, deep down, that this was the end. There would be no escape. But then, something changed. The forest, the curse, it all seemed to freeze in place, suspended in time. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, soft and golden, pushing away the darkness. For the briefest moment, the red moon flickered, as if it had been holding its breath. And then, it began to fade, slowly, as the first rays of sunlight spread across the clearing. The figure recoiled, its form starting to dissolve into the shadows. It hissed, a sound that rattled my bones, and before I could even comprehend what was happening, it vanished into the woods. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, the pressure lifting from my chest as the warmth of the sun wrapped around me. The curse, the madness, it was over. The red moon had set, and with it, the nightmare. But as I sat there, trembling and covered in dirt, I realized something. The figure was gone, but it wasn't truly defeated. The moon would rise again, someday. And when it did, it would bring the curse with it. I had survived this time, but how many more would be lost before it ended? The answer came to me slowly, creeping into my thoughts. There was no escaping it. The red moon would always return, and as long as it did, the curse would continue to spread, claiming anyone unlucky enough to witness its rise. I was the last one left. I had made it through the night, but the horror wasn't truly over. It was only just beginning. And somewhere, deep in the woods, I could feel it, the pull of the red moon, waiting for its next victims. Waiting for the night when it would call again. And this time, I wouldn't be the one to survive. The curse was eternal. It was supposed to be a simple hike. Just a quick exploration of the campgrounds before the kids arrived, a chance to get our bearings, to enjoy the fresh air. The sun had barely started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest seem deeper, more mysterious. We were a group of camp counselors, young and eager, excited for the summer to begin. There was always a sense of adventure in the air during these first few days, new friends to meet, new experiences to share. But there was something about this forest that felt different. Matt, the leader of our group, was the first to suggest it. Let's take the hollow trail. It's a shortcut, and we can check out some of the legends the campers always talk about. I've heard it's haunted or cursed or something, but I don't buy it. He laughed, but it didn't sound convincing. Leah, the most practical of us, hesitated. I don't know, Matt. People say it's dangerous. They don't let kids go on that trail for a reason. But Matt was already walking ahead, his confidence unshaken. It's fine. We'll be back before dark. So, we followed him, drawn by curiosity and the thrill of the unknown, unaware of the dark truth that awaited us along the hollow trail. The moment we stepped onto the path, the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, just a faint chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. But as we ventured deeper, the air grew colder, heavier, pressing against us like an unseen force. The trees, tall and thick, seemed to close in around us. The trail, once clear, became increasingly tangled with roots and low-hanging branches, making every step more difficult than the last. Maybe we should turn back, Leah said again, her voice tight with unease. I have a bad feeling about this. Matt rolled his eyes. It's fine, Leah. Just a few more minutes. You're acting like a kid. I didn't know if I believed Matt or Leah. Something felt off. I glanced around at the twisted trees, their bark blackened and scarred. The forest didn't feel like it was simply old, it felt ancient, as though it had been here long before us, and would be here long after we were gone. As we walked on, I began to notice strange things. Small totems and symbols carved into the trunks of trees, their shapes unfamiliar and unsettling. Some looked like faces, others like twisted animals, their eyes hollow and vacant. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, rustling leaves, seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence that swallowed everything. Then I saw it. A wooden totem, half buried in the ground, its face contorted into a grotesque scream. I shuddered at the sight of it. The wood was warped, the features of the face twisted as though they had been intentionally deformed. It didn't look like something a person would carve for decoration, it felt wrong. It didn't belong here. Hey, look at this, I called out, trying to break the growing tension. Isn't that creepy? Leah stopped in her tracks, her face pale. That's not normal. It's like someone left it here on purpose. Matt stepped up to the totem and examined it. It's just a weird sculpture. No big deal. But his words didn't sound convincing, even to him. I could tell he was just trying to mask the discomfort we all felt. Before any of us could say anything else, there was a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. The sound came from deeper in the forest, and for a moment, I thought it might be an animal. But it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was too heavy, too deliberate. "Did you hear that?" Leah whispered, her voice tight with fear. I nodded, my heart racing. Yeah. It sounded like footsteps. Matt tried to brush it off. Probably just a deer or something. Relax. But none of us could relax. Every rustling leaf, every shift in the breeze seemed like a threat now. We continued walking, but the forest seemed to close in even more, the trees pressing closer together, their branches hanging low and twisting in unnatural ways. Then we came to a clearing, if you could even call it that. The trees surrounding it were twisted and gnarled, their trunks bending and curving in bizarre ways, as though the forest itself had contorted around some unseen force. And scattered around the clearing were more totems, some small, some towering, all carved with faces or symbols that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back. I needed to turn back. But Matt was already moving deeper into the clearing, his curiosity outweighing the creeping dread in the air. "This is it," he said, a little too cheerfully. "This is what they were talking about. Some kind of ritual site." Leah was visibly shaking now. "Matt, let's go. I don't care about any stupid ritual site. I just want to get out of here." But before any of us could make a move, we heard it again. A deep, resonating thud. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. But there was no one there. Matt stopped in his tracks. What the hell was that? We all stood frozen, listening, but the forest was silent again. No birds, no wind, just that heavy silence pressing down on us. I felt my stomach churn with fear. "Let's get back," I whispered. But when we turned to leave, the path we had taken seemed different. The trees were more densely packed now, the trail winding in strange ways that didn't make sense. We hadn't gone this far, had we? The trail was looping. The same trees were repeating, the same totems appearing, and that horrible feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was like we were walking in circles. "What the hell is going on?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. "It's the forest," Matt said, his voice shaking now too. "It's messing with us. We need to keep moving." We kept walking, but the trail didn't change. Every step led us back to that clearing, back to the same totems. And then, that voice. A low, rasping sound that seemed to echo from the very earth beneath us. "Leave." I froze. It wasn't just a voice, it was something speaking, something ancient and hungry, as though the forest itself was alive and angry with us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Leah nodded, her face pale. "We need to get out. Now." But the footsteps were growing louder. Slow, heavy, relentless. I looked over my shoulder, and there it was, a dark shape, just beyond the trees. A figure, tall and shifting, almost blending into the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and empty. "Run!" Matt screamed. We bolted, but no matter how fast we ran, the trail didn't end. The darkness closed in on us, the trees reaching out like fingers, blocking our way. The footsteps were behind us, always behind us, too close now, so close I could hear the rasping breath of whatever was following us. I turned again and saw the figure, taller now, its form taking shape as it stepped out of the shadows, tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted. We ran faster, but the forest wouldn't let us go. The path looped endlessly, as if the trees themselves were trapping us, suffocating us, pulling us deeper into the darkness. And then, the voice came again, its words clear now, cold as ice. Leave, or stay forever. We weren't just lost. We were trapped. And I could feel it, the forest was claiming us, one step at a time. Hours, maybe even days, had passed since we first stepped onto the hollow trail. Time had become a blur, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling around us. The forest, ancient and malevolent, had taken hold of our minds, twisted our perceptions. One by one, we stopped speaking, our breaths shallow and labored as the darkness pressed in. The sound of those footsteps, always there, always following, had become a constant, a reminder that something was out there, something that wanted us. The totems were everywhere now, scattered across the trail like remnants of some forgotten ritual, each one watching, waiting. I had lost track of Matt and Leah. Had they been pulled into the shadows? Had they turned and run, like I wanted to? I wasn't sure anymore. The forest had swallowed them whole. And now, it was just me. Alone. Staring into the ever-encroaching darkness, my breath the only sound, the footsteps behind me growing closer with every passing second. I could feel it. It was time for me to make a choice. Leave, or stay forever. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. The kind of trip that makes memories, laughter by the campfire, the smell of pine in the air, the warmth of family surrounded by nature. Emily had insisted we go camping, and I agreed. It had been a while since we'd spent time together, just the four of us, away from the distractions of daily life. The kids, Sam and Lily, had been looking forward to it for weeks, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched them run around, collecting firewood, their excitement contagious. We set up camp just before sunset, our tents pitched in a small clearing in the woods. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faintest scent of damp earth. It was peaceful, serene. But something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliarity of the wilderness, the quiet that surrounded us, the weight of the unknown stretching beyond the edges of our camp. But that feeling lingered, like a shadow at the back of my mind. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. There was nothing out here but us and the trees. The night settled in, and we gathered around the fire. The flames flickered in the dark, casting dancing shadows on the trunks of the surrounding trees. Emily was poking at the fire, the orange glow illuminating her face as she smiled at me. The kids were roasting marshmallows, laughing at the way the sugar charred on the edges. Sam, my eldest, kept trying to make his marshmallow a perfect golden brown, while Lily, much younger, was just happy with the gooey mess she made. "I love it here," Emily said, her voice soft, content. This was a good idea. I smiled back, though I couldn't shake that unease. There was something about the stillness of the forest. The way the wind whispered between the trees. "That's the last one," I said, standing up and stretching. I'd been staring at the fire too long, the warmth beginning to make me drowsy. We were about to pack it in for the night when it happened. A sound broke through the night, something sharp and unnatural, a rustling in the brush at the edge of our camp. I turned quickly, my heart thudding in my chest, but the movement was gone. Just the wind, I thought. The trees. Then, again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and erratic. A low, dragging noise followed by a thud. I glanced at Emily, but she was already looking at me, her brow furrowed. The kids were silent now, sensing the change in the air. Maybe it's a bear or something, I said, trying to calm myself more than her. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No animal made that sound. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A man. Wild-eyed and unkempt, stumbling toward us with a desperation that instantly made my skin crawl. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, and his face pale, as if he had been living in the woods for weeks. He staggered closer, his breath ragged, his gaze darting between us like he was seeing something none of us could. "Get away from here," he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "It's coming. It's coming for you." We all froze. The kids recoiled, and Emily stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for Sam and Lily. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you all right? What's going on?" The man's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt the blood drain from my face. There was a crazed intensity in his expression, a sort of madness I couldn't understand. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice urgent. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You don't understand. It is coming for you, coming for all of you. It's in the woods. It never stops. It knows where you are. It can smell you. It will find you. It can't be outrun." I glanced at Emily, unsure of how to respond. Was this man delirious? Or was there something more to his warning? My instincts told me to be cautious, but his panic was so raw, so real. I stepped toward him, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Hey, take a breath. We're not going anywhere. Just, tell us what you mean. What's coming?" The stranger's breath hitched, and he took a shaky step back. His eyes darted nervously at the trees, his voice lowering to a whisper. It knows who you are. It knows everything about you. Don't stay here. It will never leave you alone once it's found you. It never sleeps." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods, something not entirely human. "What's your name?" Emily asked softly, taking a step forward. "We can help you." The stranger's eyes flickered nervously between us and the forest, his body shaking as though he was fighting an invisible force. Then, without another word, he turned and bolted into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. "Maybe he was just a crazy guy," I said, but the words felt hollow. Emily didn't respond, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We sat back down by the fire, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night stretched on, but sleep didn't come. Every snap of a twig in the forest made my heart race, and every rustle of the trees felt like a whisper, beckoning us into the darkness. The wind picked up again, moaning through the branches, and the crackling of the fire seemed strangely distant. Then, hours later, it came. A howl, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Low, guttural, and filled with an unnatural resonance. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. "What the hell was that?" Sam asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud thud against the side of our tent. The entire structure shook. My breath caught in my throat. Something was outside. "Stay quiet," I whispered, my voice trembling. Emily pulled the kids close to her, but they were wide-eyed, frozen with fear. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, scanning the edges of the tent. Nothing. But I could hear it, the low, dragging sound, like something moving slowly, deliberately, across the forest floor. Something big. Suddenly, the tent jerked again. The fabric rippled violently as claws scraped against the material, leaving deep gouges where the creature had raked its nails through the side. The sound was deafening, like a beast trying to tear its way inside. "Get out!" I shouted, scrambling for the zipper, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pulled harder, my hands slick with sweat. The kids were crying now, terrified, clinging to Emily. I could hear their frantic breathing, feel the suffocating fear that hung in the air. Then the clawing stopped. Silence. For a moment, everything was still. I held my breath, waiting, straining my ears for any sound, any indication that it was still out there. But the woods felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. Suddenly, I heard it again, closer this time. A growl, low and rumbling, vibrating the ground beneath us. And then, the unmistakable sound of something large moving just outside the tent. Something watching us. I couldn't wait anymore. I tore the zipper open with all my strength, the flap falling back. And there, in the shadows, standing just beyond the firelight, was the creature. It was massive. Its body hunched and twisted, like a monstrous combination of man and beast. Its eyes, glowing like coals, locked onto us, hungry, knowing. It bared its teeth, and its claws scraped against the earth, leaving deep gouges in the soil. I couldn't think. I just ran. But as I looked back, I saw the thing take a step forward. And another. It was coming for us. I didn't know if we'd survive the night. The last thing I remember is the sound of the creature's unearthly howl as it closed in, and then, nothing. Everything went black. The woods had claimed us. When I came to, I was lying on cold, damp earth. My body ached, my head throbbed with a pounding headache, and I could barely make sense of where I was. The air smelled of decay and wet leaves, the darkness surrounding me so thick it felt like a physical weight. I sat up, panic rising in my chest as memories of the night flooded back, the creature, the growls, the howls. The fear, the terror, the desperate scramble to escape. But it was quiet now. Too quiet. I called out for Emily, Sam, and Lily, my voice shaking. Emily. Sam. Lily. There was no response, only the distant rustle of leaves. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady, and looked around. The camp was gone. The fire was reduced to nothing more than a pile of ash. Our tents, the supplies, everything we had brought with us, vanished, as though it had never been there at all. I stumbled through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps, searching for any sign of them, of anything familiar. I called their names again, my voice breaking with desperation, but the forest seemed to swallow my words. It was as if the very trees themselves had turned against me, their shadows closing in tighter with each step I took. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, watching me. At first, I thought it might be the stranger, the man who had warned us, but as I got closer, my heart sank into my stomach. It wasn't him. It was something worse. The creature. It stood still, its grotesque form outlined against the dark, its eyes glowing, its jagged claws scraping against the bark of a tree. It watched me with the same intensity as before, but now there was a sense of finality in its gaze, like it had been waiting for me. Waiting for the moment when I was truly alone. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just ran, my legs moving on their own, driven by pure instinct. The howls followed me, echoing through the trees, growing louder, closer with every step. And then, finally, I heard something else. A faint voice, carried on the wind, Emily's voice, calling my name. My heart leaped in my chest. I followed the sound, my legs barely carrying me through the underbrush. I pushed through the trees, branches whipping at my face, and finally, I saw her. Emily, standing just ahead, her face pale but alive, her arms outstretched. "Come on, we have to hurry," she said urgently, as if she already knew what was behind me. I didn't question it. I grabbed her hand, and together, we ran. But the howls were still there, stalking us, relentless. We kept running, pushing forward through the darkness, not knowing where we were going, only that we had to keep moving. And then, just as I thought we couldn't run anymore, the forest opened up. We stumbled out of the woods, breathless, into an unfamiliar clearing. The night sky was clear now, the stars bright above us. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then, I heard it again, the growl. Closer. Closer still. I looked at Emily, my heart sinking. It wasn't over. We never should have come here. And now, the woods were taking everything.